I'd like to note that if you disrupt the proceedings of the committee, you will be arrested and you will be banned for 12 months from this committee. I don't know who picked 12 months, but that sounds appropriate. Second, a note that the full title of this subcommittee is Western Hemisphere, Transcontinental Crime, Civilian Security, Democracy, Human Rights, and Global Women's Issues. While the subcommittee's focus is on the Western Hemisphere, we also have jurisdiction over global health rights and democracy. And Ranking Member Kane and I will be holding some hearings this Congress on the topic of global human rights and democracies, such as this one. 5 years ago, the Chinese Communist Party imposed the so-called National Security Law on Hong Kong, an act that marked the end of one country, two systems, and culminated in the full-scale dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms, rule of law, and judicial independence. Last year, Hong Kong doubled down on its repression and enacted the Article 23 law, a sweeping expansion of the national security law that introduces dangerously vague offenses like external interference and state secrets, punishable by life in prison. This hearing is not just about an anniversary, it's about the people whose lives have been reshaped by the loss of liberty and the warning their story sends to the rest of the world. We meet today to reaffirm a bipartisan truth. Human rights do not end where the reach of the CCP begins. The United States has a moral obligation to stand firmly with those in Hong Kong whose voices have been silenced, whose rights have been stripped, and whose future has been thrown into uncertainty by the Chinese Communist Party. In the years since 2020, I've watched as courageous Hong Kongers have been arrested, exiled, and silenced. Courageous Hong Kongers like Jimmy Lai prove the CPP's fears of free voices. Mr. Lai has spent the last 4.5 years largely in solitary confinement. Authorities are so threatened by his image that the last photo of him, taken 2 years ago by an AP photographer, led to that photographer's expulsion from Hong Kong. Since then, guards have used umbrellas, tarps, and even boarded up windows to keep the world from seeing him. I've watched as judges, once seen as guardians of an impartial legal system, have become enforcers of Beijing's repression. Let's be honest, what was once an imperial legal system is now used as a political tool, twisting the law not to protect rights, but to erase them. That's why I introduced the Hong Kong Sanctions Act in the House to push for sanctions on those in the judicial system responsible for the deterioration of freedom. As if to prove my point, Hong Kong prosecutors responded to this bill by pushing a warrant for my arrest in Hong Kong. I'm proud to have joined with Senator Sullivan and my fellow subcommittee member, Senator Merkley, in reintroducing this bill in the Senate. And in the face of this, I have a message for those who believe that threats and arrest warrants from 8,000 miles away will intimidate us into silence. They won't. We will not be silenced. The louder the CCP tries to shut us down, the firmer our resolve becomes to defend freedom in Hong Kong and anywhere it is under siege. Years ago, I spent time in Hong Kong and saw firsthand a city alive with energy, enterprise, and freedom. Now, instead of a beacon of liberty, Hong Kong has become a key node in a global network that assists Russia and other adversaries in evading sanctions, money laundering, and circumventing export controls. To crack down on Hong Kong's status as a money launderer and sanctions evasion hub, I've introduced the Stop CCP Money Laundering Act. The struggle for democracy and human rights in Hong Kong is not over, and this subcommittee will continue to shine a spotlight on the abuses and advocate for accountability and action. With that, I now recognize the distinguished ranking member. My honor to serve with you, Senator Kane, for your remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the great witnesses and all who are attending. As the chairman mentioned, this subcommittee has one of the longest titles of any subcommittee in the Senate. It's 15 words. Maybe somebody can beat us. But it is important to note that while the regional focus of the subcommittee is the Western Hemisphere, all of the foreign relations subcommittees also have subject matter jurisdictions. And it's really, really good that this jurisdiction focuses on human rights and other really important issues. And the chair and I have agreed that while the majority of our hearings will likely be within the hemisphere, we will also do some global hearings like this one on important human rights issues, which are obviously important in the Western Hemisphere as well. As we begin, I'm going to address one topic at the beginning that ties into the hearing today. It's really important for me and my constituents in Virginia because Virginia is home to many thousands of dedicated public servants, including those who work at the State Department and related agencies. The rifts in recent weeks at state have really focused on efforts to dismantle the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at state. I'm not sure our adversaries have vigorous human rights portfolios where they think about human rights around the world and try to influence them in a positive direction. And I'm not sure that their ministries of foreign affairs really focus so much on these issues as we do. It's been a hallmark of this committee and of our State Department generally that this has been a priority across administrations of both parties. To the State Department employees whose morale is pretty low now, and those of you who've received RIF notices, I just want to say I really admire your devotion to public service. I have visited with you all over the globe. I commend you for wanting to make the world a safer place and standing up for human rights values. We can proudly proclaim them, even though we need to be humble always about our own efforts and the need to do more both at home and abroad. Whether through political means, judicial redress of grievances, legislative advocacy, or organizing, please stay engaged. And it's directly relevant to our hearing today. I would like to introduce, Mr. Chair, an article from June 6, 2025, the Washington Post. Chinese propaganda surges as the U.S. defunds Radio Free Asia. If I could ask that to be entered into the record.
Without objection.
The proposed U.S. 2026 fiscal year budget proposes to take 82% of the funding out of our global media efforts. And we need to fight disinformation in the information space. We're not only laying people off, we're hobbling those efforts. I don't think we can safely assume that we can take the State Department's pro-human rights, pro-democracy efforts and just subsume them within the regionals and have the priority be what they need to be. I also believe that the rescissions package that we passed like last week will do additional damage to this important priority. And I do think it's important for the U.S., again, with the humility about our own imperfections, to continue to stand up for folks around the world who are under the thumb of authoritarians and dictators, and you can't do that without people. All right, this is a really timely hearing, and we're going to hear from witnesses about their assessment of where democratic values and human rights stand in Hong Kong, as the chair said, 5 years after the enactment of the national security law. As you all might know, the PRC imposed this law 5 years ago on Hong Kong to clamp down on civil society following large-scale protests against a bill allowing the extradition of fugitives to mainland China, which many in Hong Kong viewed as directly in contravention with commitments that the PRC had made with respect to the status of Hong Kong and those living there. Some of the drastic impacts of implementation of the law, including a chilling effect on activists, political opposition groups, dissidents, and other civil society stakeholders. Let me give a couple of quick examples. Hong Kong National Security Police have arrested the father and brother of activist Anna Kwok for allegedly dealing with her finances. This is the first use of the city's security law to deal with the relatives of activists who have had to flee Hong Kong in fear of retaliation. Many activists, including Ms. Joyce Su, who's here today, have bounties for their capture based on spurious accusations about their human rights work being driven by collusion with foreign actors, as if people who live in Hong Kong can't have their own desire for human rights. Why would human rights have to be something that could only be ginned up by collusion with foreign actors rather than something that lives within the heart of freedom-loving people anywhere in the world? Let me be very clear. Oh, I also wanted to mention Jimmy Lai, who is still in prison, has been described by Amnesty International as a prisoner of conscience. Protesting should not be a crime. Demanding to live in a free and democratic society should not be a crime. Speaking out against authoritarianism should not be a crime. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today about their experience being unjustly persecuted for wanting to live in a democratic society, their assessment of where the U.S. policy has had success or could have more success, how Congress can play a role in fostering democracy and respect for human rights. The shared values of democracy, freedom of expression, rule of law should remain at the core of our foreign policy. I know the chairman of this subcommittee believes deeply in that, and I do as well. Let me turn it back over to the chair to introduce the witnesses and then get this hearing underway. I see the vote still hasn't started, so we may be able to do a really long hearing before we have to go.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator Kaine. It is really an honor to do this work with you, and appreciate your reminder when we first met that the committee's jurisdiction was over human rights and far broader than just the Western Hemisphere. And I jumped into this so quickly, I didn't really have a chance to welcome our witnesses. I'm sorry I wasn't here to greet you before. This is a very impressive group of witnesses, and I'm pleased to have every single one of you here today. We're going to start with Olivia Enos, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where she writes on a wide range of human rights and national security issues in Asia. She's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and a contributor at Forbes. She previously worked at as Washington's director of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, and before that as a senior policy analyst for Asian Studies at the Heritage Foundation, where she wrote about international human rights issues, including human trafficking, transnational crime, religious freedom, and democratic freedoms, among other social issues in China, North Korea, Burma, and other parts of Asia. She received her MA in Asian Studies from Georgetown University and a BA in Government from Patrick Henry College. And the time is now yours. We just jumped right over it, assuming you all know how to work the buttons. You each have 5 minutes, so please begin.
Chairman Curtis and Ranking Member Kaine and other members of this subcommittee, thank you so much for inviting me to testify today. Since 2020, freedom in Hong Kong declined precipitously. The impacts of this decline affect not only the fundamental human rights of Hong Kongers, but also the national and economic security of the US and the world. Hong Kong was once a bastion of liberty in Asia, but since 2019, the Special Administrative Region has taken just shy of 2,000 political prisoners, including well-known figures like Jimmy Lai, Gwyneth Ho, and Joshua Wong. It has shuttered pro-democracy press like Apple Daily and Stand News, and engages in transnational repression through the issuance of bounties on well-known overseas pro-democracy advocates, including U.S. citizen Joey Siu, who is testifying here today, my former Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation colleague Francis Hui, and 17 other Hong Kongers in the U.S., United Kingdom, and Australia. Hong Kong's near overnight transformation is the result of the passage of the National Security Law, which created 4 new political crimes, including secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign and external forces. The NSL was compounded by the passage of Article 23 legislation, which added an additional 5 new categories of security crimes, including treason, insurrection and sedition, theft of state secrets and espionage, external interference, and sabotage activities. Hong Kong authorities today act as an extension of the Chinese Communist Party. This is most evident in the distinct erosions in the rule of law, which have implications that extend far beyond the undermining of civil liberties and freedoms. In a groundbreaking CFHK report, Hong Kong advocate and lawyer Samuel Bickett documented evidence for Hong Kong's ongoing policies of sanctions evasion on behalf of rogue actors, including but not limited to Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Bickett's report goes beyond the headlines that we all know, that Chief Executive John Lee has openly flouted U.S. and international law by refusing to enforce sanctions, and provides credible evidence that Hong Kong companies engage in ship-to-ship transfers, provide dual-use technologies or components, and establish shell companies to evade sanctions on behalf of rogue regimes. Most notably, Hong Kong contributes substantially toward Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. From August to December 2023 alone, Bickett's report found that Hong Kong provided over $2 billion in shipments of banned goods to support Russia. Hong Kong presents among the clearest examples of what happens when the U.S. does not effectively counter the CCP's threats to human rights and good governance. And America is not immune from the impacts of Hong Kong's decline. As a direct result of the CCP's undermining of rule of law, Hong Kong is now a risky place to do business. Transnational repression, including on U.S. soil, is increasing, and the rights of Hong Kongers continue to be violated. Unfortunately, Hong Kong's decline is happening amid waning commitments from the U.S. to safeguard and defend human rights. Reductions in force at the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. Department of State, planned cuts to nearly all U.S. government grants supporting human rights and democracy globally, and the targeting of Radio Free Asia, which recently shuttered its Cantonese service, hamstring U.S. ability to advance human rights in Hong Kong and beyond. These cuts are being made at precisely the same time that the CCP is threatening human rights at historic levels. This will have severe implications for U.S. national security in the present and will undercut U.S. efforts to support human rights abroad for decades to come. While it may be true that in the short term, it is unlikely that Hong Kong will revert to its previous freedom-loving, semi-autonomous state, it is inaccurate to say that there are no tools at the U.S.'s disposal to hold the CCP and Hong Kong officials accountable and alleviate the suffering of the Hong Kong people. I ask that my full testimony, which includes more than 20 policy recommendations, be submitted for the record, but I will highlight 7 policy actions now. Congress and the administration should first oppose cuts to grants and key personnel supporting democracy and human rights at the Department of State. Second, issue targeted sanctions against individuals and entities responsible for implementing, enforcing, prosecuting, and ruling on the NSL and Article 23 legislation. Third, consider whether certain entities or sets of transactions in Hong Kong can be designated as primary money laundering concerns. Fourth, continue appropriations for Radio Free Asia and press for pre-existing funds to be released so that they can continue operating and ideally restart, at the very least, the Cantonese, Uyghur, and Tibetan services. 5, press for the release of all political prisoners in Hong Kong and consider creating an Office of Political Prisoner Advocacy at the U.S. Department of State. 6, consider revoking the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office's special privileges and immunities. And finally, continue to provide refugee and asylum safe haven to Hong Kongers in need. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now turn to Sophie Richardson, who is a longtime activist and scholar of Chinese politics, human rights, and foreign policy. From 2006 to 2023, she served as the China Director of Human Rights Watch, where she oversaw the organization's research and advocacy. She speaks Mandarin and received her doctorate from the University of Virginia and her BA from Oberlin College. Her current research focuses on the global implications of democracies, weak responses to increasingly repressive Chinese governments, and is advising several China-focused human rights organizations. Dr. Richardson.
Chairman Curtis, Ranking Member Kane, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to join this important and timely discussion about human rights and democracy in Hong Kong. Over the past 5 years, the Chinese government has accelerated its assault on every aspect of what made Hong Kong a center for thriving civic life, free media, the rule of law, professional law enforcement, and opportunities for democratic participation. I'd like to start with our collective acknowledgement that growing authoritarianism has influenced even who can sit on this panel. Successive Congresses have expressed their concern about and solidarity with Hong Kong human rights and democracy activists, including those based inside and outside Hong Kong, by welcoming them to testify. But aggressive global threats have made such participation a gravely risky proposition. My organization, Chinese Human Rights Defenders, has documented 2 aspects of Chinese President Xi Jinping's nationwide assault on human rights that illustrate significant rollbacks of rights for Hong Kong people. First, between 2019 and 2024, according to available data, Chinese authorities arbitrarily detained and convicted 1,545 people, 123 of them in Hong Kong, for peacefully exercising or advocating for human rights. During this time period, more individuals in Hong Kong were convicted of subversion and inciting subversion than in mainland China. And the average prison sentence in Hong Kong under the 2020 national security law is more than 5 years. Second, CHRD has documented numerous cases of authorities inflicting collective punishment on Hong Kong human rights defenders. The harassment or police or administrative actions taken against persons in a group or a family in retaliation for an act committed by an individual. There is no legal basis or justification for collective punishment in Chinese, Hong Kong, or international law. These violations are an affront not only to Hong Kong's obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but they're also an affront to the laws of democracies in which many activists now live. Congress has been key in pushing forward some of the most important U.S. support for human rights in Hong Kong, and with that history in mind, I'd like to offer the following recommendations. First, CHRD strongly supports the potentially transformative importance of investigating and prosecuting Chinese government officials for alleged crimes against humanity and genocide targeting Uyghurs. Making the prospect of facing justice a tangible reality could make those officials reconsider their involvement in widespread and systematic abuses. Along these lines, an appropriate initiative with respect to Hong Kong could include an effort that would collect evidence of government officials' complicity in serious human rights violations. Many civil society groups have assembled information that could contribute to such an endeavor. Second, CHRD encourages sanctioning officials implicated in human rights abuses in Hong Kong. Democracy should also condition at least symbolic interactions with senior leaders from Beijing and Hong Kong on the release of wrongfully detained human rights defenders, with a particular urgency for those who are reportedly unwell in detention, such as Albert Ho and Jimmy Lai. Recall that we recently observed the 8th anniversary of the death in state custody of 2010 Nobel Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo, whom Beijing imprisoned for his pro-democracy calls. Democracy should also prioritize its senior levels, listening the views of Hong Kong human rights and democracy activists in policy formulation. CHRD urges Congress to reinstate support for Radio Free Asia and Voice of America, and urges Congress to reject the OMB's recommendation to eliminate China-focused funding for democracy and human rights work. To do this, to erase this work empowers Xi Jinping, disadvantages the U.S., and demoralizes and puts at risk many people from and across Hong Kong and China who courageously work for human rights and democracy. In closing, I would like to recall that in May 2017, just a few months before Liu Xiaobo's death, two of Hong Kong's pro-democracy icons, veteran barrister and legislator Martin Lee and student activist Joshua Wong, testified before the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which at the time was chaired by then Senator Rubio. Senator Rubio stressed the importance of autonomy, free speech, and political participation in Hong Kong, noting, quote, "Our hope is to continue to highlight human rights as a key pillar of our national security and foreign policy," close quote, and stressing the connection between human rights and economic ties. Lee and Wong spoke memorably of their determination to work for human rights and democracy in Hong Kong as a matter of security and of values, and come what may, for themselves, their families, and their allies. The U.S. should honor these aspirations and so many people's extraordinary work and sacrifices, and challenge Beijing at every opportunity to uphold its obligations under international human rights law. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. Joy Sue, it's nice to have you with us. Nice to see you again. Joy is the spokesperson of Amnesty International Hong Kong overseas. She also serves on the Executive Council of the World Liberty Congress, a global coalition of pro-democracy advocates. As a student leader, she played a crucial role during the 2019 pro-democracy protest in Hong Kong, organizing both on-campus and citywide demonstrations, which is when I first met her. In December 2023, the Hong Kong authorities issued an international arrest warrant for her, a U.S. citizen, for allegedly violating the draconian national security law with her advocacy, offering a bounty of 1 million Hong Kong dollars. I might just note, too, just to note the bipartisan nature of this, our next two witnesses are here as bipartisan witnesses as well. So, Ms. Xu.
Chairman Curtis, Ranking Member Kane, Senators Merkley and Shaheen, and this committee, thank you so much for having me. The PRC's implementation of the National Security Law of 2020 severely restricted Hong Kongers' freedoms and rights. And with that, we saw the erosion of Hong Kong's freedom of expression with the forced closure of Apple Daily and other media outlets. Journalists and publishers, including Jimmy Lai, have been persecuted simply for publishing dissent, resulting in an absolute chilling effect where censorship is now the norm in Hong Kong. Freedom of assembly has also been eradicated. For 30 years, Hong Kong was the only place under PRC rule where June 4th candlelight vigils were allowed. But since 2020, commemorations have been banned, and lighting a candle is now a crime in Hong Kong. What was once a symbol for remembrance and courage is now treated as subversion. And then there is also the destruction of the freedom of association. Last month, the League of Social Democrats, Hong Kong's last functioning pro-democracy party, was forcibly disbanded. And since 5 years ago, almost 100 labor unions, churches, student organizations, and civil society groups have been intimidated into silence. And to suffocate the already shrinking and limited political space, the Hong Kong authorities further introduced the Safeguarding National Security Ordinance, which is also known as Article 23, creating new national security offenses and increasing penalties for existing ones. It granted the Hong Kong government sweeping enforcement powers under the PRC's broad and vague national security and state secret grounds. With this subcommittee's focus on Western Hemisphere, I was I want to note that today across all of the Latin America region, a region of over 660 million people, there are around 3,300 political prisoners. And in Hong Kong, a tiny little city of just 7 million people, the number is currently at 1,940. And I think this staggering figure speaks to the scale of the PRC's repression and takeover of Hong Kong in the past 5 years. And among these people, I would like to note that there's Chow Hang-tung, a human rights lawyer now arbitrarily detained for organizing June 4th commemorations and spending her days and nights now in solitary confinement. There is also Leung Kwok-hong, a former legislator who was persecuted for participating in peaceful democratic primary elections. And then there are also young leaders like myself, including my friend Owen Chow, a freshly graduated nurse who was once the city's brightest rising political stars, now serving 12 years and 10 months in prison solely for being a voice of the Hong Kong people. And unfortunately, all sign indicates that there is something darker ahead for Hong Kong. The court system in Hong Kong now seeks total isolation of dissidents rather than just arrest and prosecution. Just last week, the Hong Kong government tightened the prison rules to restrict lawyer and chaplain visits on vague national security grounds, cutting these detainees off from legal counsel even before conviction. This black box for potential torture and inhumane treatment profoundly undermines the presumption of innocence and weaponizes incarceration as a psychological warfare. I would also like to note that the judiciary in Hong Kong right now is also exploited as a vehicle for persecution, delivering preordained convictions with legal definitions that are manipulated and expanded endlessly to fit the PRC's agenda, waging a legal warfare that criminalizes not just speech and behavior, but also thought. The government's campaign against the so-called soft resistance inside of Hong Kong is the latest iteration of this effort, where a blank piece of paper or a silent gesture are all considered national security threats that can land you in prison for up to 10 years or for life. And the national security apparatus continues to expand beyond the democracy and human rights scope, with new economic security mandates leading to business surveillance and censorship. Cultural correctness campaigns now regulate art, literature, films, productions, and even school curricula in Hong Kong. And unfortunately, what is more is that the PRC's takeover of Hong Kong does not stop at the borders. As the chairman mentioned, on December 13, 2023, I woke up to the news that I had become the first and by far the only U.S. citizen wanted by the Hong Kong authorities for allegedly violating the national security law by colluding with a foreign country, the United States, my own country, and with a 1 million Hong Kong dollar bounty out there for my arrest. This growing transnational repression against me and the overall crackdown of Hong Kong, I think both illustrate the PRC's blueprint for its export of authoritarian practices. And if we, the United States, allow it to destroy Hong Kong without consequences, it will soon spill over to Taiwan, the Indo-Pacific, and Latin America. And the United States must respond with moral clarity and strategic commitment by first prioritizing human rights as a core U.S. foreign policy principle. Second, to continue to press for the immediate release of all Hong Kong's prisoners of conscience, specifically Chow Hang-tung, Jimmy Lai, Leung Kwok-hong, and Owen Chow. Third, to sustain and increase federal funding for organizations that support Hong Kong's resistance, including but not limited to the National Endowment for Democracy, Radio Free Asia, among others. And last but not least, to guarantee humanitarian resettlement pathways for Hong Kongers, because these brave voices and people deserve a safe haven to tell stories that alarm the world of the PRC's aggressions. And with that, I want to end with a quote from Owen, my dear friend. Evil always wreaks more havoc when the forces of good have been weakened. So let us latch onto the good and hold fast. And once again, I want to thank you for your attention on this important matter and for being that force of good. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Su. I'm not sure how to take it that my arrest warrant came with no bounty and yours was $1 million. I think that tells us a little bit about your work. Finally, Caoilfhionn Gallagher is an international human rights lawyer. Over the past 25 years, she has acted in many leading human rights cases in the UK, Europe, and internationally. Her caseload includes leading the international legal terms for Jimmy Lai, the publisher and pro-democracy campaigner unjustly imprisoned in Hong Kong. Alongside her practice as a barrister, she is a commissioner of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, Ireland's special reporter on child protection, a board member of the Committee to Protect Journalists, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and an adjunct full professor at University College Dublin. In 2023, she was awarded the President of Ireland's Distinguished Service Award in recognition of her work. We're glad to have you with us today, and you now have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Curtis and Ranking Member Kane and members of the subcommittee for inviting me to give testimony today about this important topic, the status of democracy and human rights in Hong Kong. And that topic and the fate of one man are inextricably linked. And my client, Jimmy Lai, about whom you've heard from the other witnesses. Jimmy Lai's case is emblematic of the crackdown on human rights, media freedom and democracy in Hong Kong that we've seen in the past half-decade. Now, as you've heard, Hong Kong was until relatively recently a beacon in the region, a bastion of the free press, a place with a flourishing civil society, adherence to international standards, the rule of law was intact, businesses and foreign investment benefited from this stable and certain environment. But Hong Kong's descent into a very different place has been precipitous. It has plummeted down the press freedom rankings. For example, it's tumbled from 18th in the world a decade ago to now languishing at the bottom of the league table in the red zone, 140 out of 180 countries in the world. It's nestled in the table most recently with Kazakhstan and Rwanda, beaten by Guatemala and Congo. Now, in these brief opening remarks, I wish to address three topics. First, a very brief overview on Jimmy Lai and what he stands for, with the man being emblematic of Hong Kong's freedoms, which we've seen lost. Secondly, a brief overview of what's happened to him in the past 5 years, emblematic of Hong Kong's deterioration. And then thirdly and critically, what must be done. So first of all, very briefly, and there's more detail in my written testimony, Jimmy Lai is a remarkable man, brave, brilliant, dogged, forged in fires, as his deputy and right-hand man, Mark Simon, who sits here today, often says. He came as a child refugee to Hong Kong, aged only 12, stowing away on a boat, and he became one of the most successful businessmen in the region. But since the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests and massacre, he's been a leading figure in the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement, and he used his wealth for good. He's a well-known and high-profile advocate for democracy and peaceful assembly, a fearless critic of the government and authorities of the PRC. Apple Daily quickly became one of Hong Kong's most popular newspapers, and it was the largest independent Chinese-language media outlet in the region until its forced closure in June 2021. And for Mr. Lai, access to free and independent information gives people choice, and choice is freedom. And through his fearlessly independent journalism and his peaceful pro-democracy activism, he became a figurehead in the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement, a courageous critic of human rights violations perpetrated by the authorities. And to use his own words, he said this: "I think it is my duty to do whatever I can to fight for freedom and keep the rule of law here." Now, secondly, the lawfare he's faced since 2020. Again, more detail in my written testimony. Mr. Lai has over the years trod on powerful toes, and the authorities have long hated him for it and targeted him for it in multiple ways, including financially, with his business and his home being firebombed, him being targeted in multiple ways to try to silence him. But in the past 5 years, the most powerful tool of all has been used effectively against him, and that's the law. What we've seen is a barrage of spurious lawsuits and prosecutions against him, all designed to do one thing: to silence him and to have a chilling effect on any others who might dare to speak truth to power. And since his arrest in August 2020 under the draconian national security law, he has served 4 sentences of imprisonment. He's currently serving a 5th. The United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has found that he shouldn't have served a single day in prison, and that every single one of those sentences and every single one of those prosecutions involve multiple violations of his fair trial and due process rights, and they found that his detention is arbitrary. He's now on trial for alleged sedition and conspiracy to collude with foreign forces, a vaguely defined offence under the NSL that allows for its arbitrary application to legitimate acts of free speech. And if convicted, he faces life imprisonment, which in reality, given his age, means a death sentence. He's currently facing trial for sedition, which is essentially conspiracy to commit journalism, and under the national security law for collusion with foreign forces. And US government and US lawmakers are at the heart of the allegations against him, meeting with senators, meeting with members of the US government is presented as being criminal. But most urgently of all are the humanitarian issues. Time is frankly running out for Mr. Lai. The conditions of his detention, his age and his health make this case exceptionally urgent. He will turn 78 later this year. He has now spent almost half a decade in solitary confinement, when international law makes clear that anything over 14 days is problematic. He's denied natural sunlight. He's incarcerated in a tiny airless cell for over 23 hours per day. And put frankly, this in itself poses a threat to his life, as does the long sentence he will face if, as is inevitable, he's convicted under the national security law. And just finally, multiple governments, including the US government and the UK government, multiple parliaments and international bodies have now called for Jimmy Lai's immediate and unconditional release. And we welcome that. The international consensus is clear on what should happen. He should be released. The key question now is how to ensure it does happen before it's too late. We've seen with US leadership, political will and creativity and joint working with partners resulting in remarkable releases in recent months, including on Friday from Venezuela and that remarkable deal last August involving the Russian releases. We now need political will and creativity and working with partners in order to ensure that we don't see this man die behind bars for being a journalist and for standing up for values the US holds dear. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses. I'll now begin the question round by yielding myself 5 minutes to begin the question. And I have a question initially for all of you. We'll start over here with Olivia. The United States has tried several policy tools, everything from sanctions to public diplomacy in response to this repression that you all have articulated so well. I'd like to know what specific steps you would like to see Congress take, and maybe narrow that down to just the one or two, and specifically what the legislative branch can do.
Thank you. So I have one overarching recommendation and then three very quick ones that are specific to Hong Kong. I promise I'll be quick. The first is we just have to continue to support funding and grants and the continuation of DRL's good work because apart from it, there are many organizations that will be shut down who are essential to maintaining the continuation of solid work on Hong Kong, but on China generally. And without those grants, many of them will close even as soon as the end of the summer, some for sure by the end of the year. My three Hong Kong specific ones is first, I would love to see a primary money laundering concern designation issued for Hong Kong. Congress can hold the administration's feet to the fire by putting them on a specific timeline or reporting requirement, asking them to investigate whether certain entities or sets of transactions qualify as a primary money laundering concern. This is so important because it's a cross-cutting measure. It speaks to the fact that rule of law is undermined and that business as usual is not, it is not business as usual. The second is to press for the release of all political prisoners in Hong Kong. We have to be doing that daily. Members of Congress can adopt political prisoners. They should do so for Hong Kongers. And then the third is to ensure the extension of deferred enforced departure for Hong Kongers past its original deadline, but also to ensure long-term permanent pathways for resettlement. Sorry.
Ms. Xu.
I think Olivia already noted, several accountability tools that the U.S. has in hand and can utilize in terms of, protecting Hong Kong's democracy and human rights. And I would also like to note that how the funding cut has been impacting the Hong Kong diaspora community and organizations that have been supporting Hong Kong's resistance, particularly regarding the National Endowment for Democracy and Radio Free Asia. With the forced shutdown of Apple Daily, Stand News, and other media outlets, we're seeing that there is a huge gap in terms of, ensuring that the news from Hong Kong coming out. And for so many years, especially over the past 5 years, Radio Free Asia have filled that gap. And we need to ensure that the funding is sustained for organizations, including the RFA and VOA, to ensure that we understand what is happening in Hong Kong currently to inform the U.S. policy. And also in regards to the net, I think it is really important that we restore the funding that are dedicated to supporting freedom and human rights inside of Hong Kong, because I believe it is very, very important that we make sure that we're not just supporting the on-the-ground resistance verbally, but then also through meaningful, contributions. So I would say that was the number one priority. And secondly, I think there are also several legislations currently in the Congress that we should be passing, including the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act, which I know that the chairman also supports. For so long, the HAE2 has been used as a tool to expand the CCP's influence in the United States and very recently infiltrate on the Hong Kong diaspora community, and their status must be reviewed.
Thank you. Dr. Richardson.
Very quickly, I think Congress should start considering requiring U.S. businesses to conduct human rights due diligence on their operations in Hong Kong to make sure that they are not creating or contributing to violations. I think this both helps make sure that the ICCPR and other laws are upheld. I think it also would help end the mixed messaging that results from seeing U.S. businesses showing up and working with precisely some of the same people who are responsible for carrying out human rights violations.
Thank you. And am I going to pronounce it right, Keelan?
Keelan, yes.
Okay.
It's got rather a lot of letters,
yes,
but it's just pronounced Keelan.
Okay.
As you can imagine, I get called all sorts of things.
I can imagine, yeah.
So I just raise a few things. The first thing is to say China is, of course, not unusual in targeting dissidents, journalists, those who speak truth to power. But something which is a little different with Hong Kong is that fig leaf of due process. The fact that it's essentially a police state, but trying to masquerade still as a place where you can do business as usual. It's trying to still masquerade as a place which is a financial centre. And indeed, just recently they've announced a new international court where they want to challenge the International Court of Justice and have their own form of court there. So they do want to maintain that fiction of one country, two systems. And seems to me that that gives us real leverage, because we know it's in their policy interests to have Hong Kong return to being a place where the rule of law is intact. So highlighting the false narrative in the way that this hearing is doing is hugely helpful, is the first thing I would say. Second thing I would say...
All right, just quickly, I'm over time, but go
of course.
ahead. I think my colleagues will give me just a minute grace.
Of course. Second thing I would say is it seems to us that the US and UK governments working together should be key to securing Jimmy Lai's release. He's a British national, but his case is intimately connected with the US in many ways. And for senators in particular, we would ask that in your interaction with the State Department and NSC staff in the coming months, given that there's just been coverage suggesting that there may be some high-level engagements at APEC towards the end of October, and also potentially even a high-level visit to China, it's essential that the release of Jimmy Lai is raised in all of the preparatory meetings before any high-level engagement, and it should be front and centre of the agenda in the coming months.
Thank you. All wonderful answers. I made it through one of my many pages, one question of my many pages. I would like to point out before I pass the microphone, and I was going to ask you all about this, but I think you'd agree, if we don't pass any new Hong Kong measures this Congress, there is a risk that that's interpreted by the CPP as silent. That silence is that we're accepting what's happening over there. I'd just like to point that out. And with that, I yield and give 5 minutes to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just on the Jimmy Lai, I just want to acknowledge Senator Risch, the chair of the committee, has also been pretty active with many of us in repeated statements on behalf of Jimmy Lai, and I know that will continue. Ms. Su, you've testified here before, and so you know that people in the room and people watching are a mixture of experts in the topic who care deeply about it, and people who are coming to the topic new and who care deeply about it. So I'm going to ask you a very basic question. Why is the CCP afraid of you? You're a 26-year-old who started your advocacy when you were about 17 or 18. Why would they be afraid enough of you to put $1 million yuan bounty on your head?
I think that's because I create troubles. I've been doing that since I became a student activist in 2019. And unfortunately, I think my personal stories mirrors one of, Hong Kongers' overall resistance. I met the Chairman Curtis, back in 2019 when I was a student activist organizing citywide protests and, demonstrations on campus. That was also when Hong Kongers, in a small city of only 7 million people, as I noted, 2 million took onto the street to say no to the CCP's oppressions. And following that, the CCP has, doubled down on its crackdowns on our freedoms to assembly, expression, and association.
And by trouble, you mean assembly.
Yeah.
Which we are guaranteed in this country, the right to peacefully assemble to petition government for redress of grievances, expression, protest. I don't view peaceful activity as trouble, but apparently some do. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. The CCP sees our exercising of our rights to freedoms of assembly, association, and expression as a huge trouble. And that is why I think precisely the reason why they decided to further introduce the Safeguarding National Security Ordinance on top of the National Security Law.
And if I could just, on the expression side, you referenced briefly in your testimony, but didn't explain, but again, for those who are here who care, but may not be experts, the blank paper protest. So in Hong Kong and other parts of China, the degree of suppression of expression was so great that creative activists began holding up blank sheets of paper with no figures on them whatsoever as a way of demonstrating there are things we would like to say, but the repression of this government means that we cannot even put anything on this sheet of paper. And then the Chinese government has cracked down on the use of blank sheets of paper. Am I right about that?
You're correct.
And they've not only cracked down on it, but they've scrubbed social media accounts because Chinese citizens were searching blank sheet of paper, wonder what this is all about. And there has been a crackdown on the availability of even that search for Chinese citizens to find out what a blank sheet of paper means.
Yes, that is correct. And you see, after the introduction of Article 23, there had also been arrests and convictions made in Hong Kong for people who have worn a T-shirt with protest slogans. There have been arrests of individuals who have written protest slogans on buses and held blank pieces of paper in protest of the government with nothing written on it. And I think that speaks to the scale of the PRC's takeover and repression in Hong Kong.
Let me ask you one other question. There's an article that I'd like to introduce in the record. It's from Radio Free Asia. The title, CCP cheers RFA Cantonese's demise, dated July 9, 2025, recently. Talk a little bit about what Cantonese language Radio Free Asia has meant to Hong Kongers.
As I said, Senator Kaine, for the past 5 years, especially following the closure of Apple Daily and Stand News, RFA has become one of the few sources that kept on reporting about what has been developing inside of Hong Kong with Article 23 and the National Security Law. It was not just a source for Hong Kongers outside of Hong Kong or the international community to understand what the PRC is doing inside of Hong Kong, but also a source for people who are on the ground to understand what is happening, given that the PRC have revoked visas for international journalists and shut down other media outlets reporting on court news and everything else. And I cannot stress enough how important the Cantonese service of RFA has been to the people of Hong Kong. And just last month, the month before RFA's forced shutdown due to the funding cuts, they have reached 1.2 million people, readers online. And I think that speaks to the importance of RFA.
With that, I'll yield the remainder of my time back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the senator from New Hampshire for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Last week, the minority members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the entire committee, released a report that highlights how the Trump administration's actions in the first 6 months in office have undermined our ability to compete with China. This is the report. If you haven't already seen it, I would offer it for anyone's interest. A clear example of this is the one you were just referring to, Ms. Slew, with Senator Kaine, and that is the administration silencing our voice in Hong Kong through Radio Free Asia. Since Hong Kong's handover to China in 1998, Radio Free Asia, as you pointed out so well, has served as a beacon of independent media The administration's decision to withhold congressionally appropriated funds resulted in the closure of Radio Free Asia's Cantonese operations exactly 5 years since the enactment of the draconian national security law. And what I think is significant, and you alluded to this, is that Chinese officials celebrated this news, calling it, and I quote, a huge victory for real Asian journalism. So, Ms. Liu, you talked about what the consequences are of abandoning this independent media in Hong Kong. Can you and any other members of the panel also talk about how the PRC is taking advantage of that closure?
Sure. Thank you, Senator Shaheen, for the question, and I will try to be quick about that. With the shutdown of RFA on July 1st, unfortunately, there is, little to no independent media that is still operating in Hong Kong that can actually report about the on-the-ground developments. And unfortunately, that created a huge gap, which is filled by Chinese state-affiliated media, such as Tai Kung Pao, TVB, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that also creates this huge information gap that really does not help when it comes to informing U.S. policy in regards to Hong Kong. So I do think it is so important that we resume the funding so that the Cantonese service, and as well as my panelist, Olivia has mentioned, the Tibetan and Uyghur service, because those have been, really the beacon of, democracy and independent media voices. So I will stop there and then yield to my...
Yes, Dr. Richardson.
Thank you very much, Senator Shaheen. I actually wanted to thank you for a different point that's made in that report, which is about the U.S. withdrawal from the Human Rights Council. This is one of the only institutions available for human rights activists from across China to try, at enormous risk, to bring forward issues to get some redress. The Chinese government consistently tops the league tables year after year for reprisals against activists for trying to engage with UN human rights mechanisms. The Chinese government has become extremely adept at influencing that system, changing how it works, shutting its critics out. And it's a Byzantine institution. It's not the one I would design. But let's be clear, leaving it to an authoritarian regime that has lots of resources and a clear commitment to making it not about human rights is deeply problematic. So thank you for flagging that.
Well, thank you. And can you talk a little bit about what kind of message that sends to the people of Hong Kong and to others who are looking at our withdrawal from that organization?
I think it is confusing and demoralizing. I think it's already extremely difficult for Chinese activists and activists from Hong Kong to interact with that system and to not necessarily have the leadership and the air cover, so to speak, that democratic governments can bring to bear in keeping those institutions open for their participation, pushing to make sure that they're admitted, that events reflect their views, that their reports are contributed, that their voices are heard. That's an incredibly, I assume you would agree, an incredibly important part of how activists can bring their issues forward.
Thank you.
And if I may just add, Senator Shaheen, I think there is a widespread confusion among the Hong Kong people who are still resisting on the ground as in why we're conceding the space, this very, very important narrative space to the Chinese Communist Party. And I do think there is also huge concern shared by the Hong Konger community as in who is going to take over that gap that is being left out by the forced closure of Cantonese service under RFA. And we all know that that is going to be the CCP.
Ms. Enos, did you
I just wanted to add that the CCP is already overtaking the shortwave frequencies that Radio Free Asia used, and that's not just in the Chinese context. I also work on Korea, and this is happening in the North Korean context as well. And I think that what is happening with Radio Free Asia is a microcosm of the broader challenge that we're having with the U.S. says we're going to leave human rights promotion and democracy promotion up to other people around the world who don't share our same values. And I would also just note that one of the most important things that Congress can do on this is to ensure that Radio Free Asia has a separate line item, not underneath the USAGM auspices, but a separate line item for appropriations that make it possible for Radio Free Asia to be depoliticized in the current context.
Thank you. I would also add to that the defunding of the U.S. Agency for Global Media has significantly also limited the operations of Voice of America's 450 Latin American affiliates. And since this subcommittee deals with those issues, I think it's important to add that into the record as well. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. I'd like to yield to the senator from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, first, thanks each of you for being here. Thank you for what you do each and every day. Anyone who pays attention to the evils of the Chinese Communist Party knows the name Jimmy Lai. Jimmy is a great advocate for free press and a hardworking entrepreneur who is being held as a political prisoner in Hong Kong because he didn't cower to Xi Jinping or censor the atrocities he committed. What the Chinese Communist Party is doing to him is disgusting. And let's be clear, Xi Jinping and his thugs are responsible for this abusive treatment of Mr. Lai, not the government of Hong Kong, which is nothing more than a puppet of Beijing. Jimmy's a friend. It's an honor to speak on his behalf and do whatever I can to help return him to freedom. To each of you, what can be done to help Jimmy, Lai, and other political prisoners? However you want to start.
I think that Jimmy Lai is, such an important figure because he represents, as you said, freedom in general. I think there are several things that Congress can do and several things that the administration can do. First, it was encouraging to see that Jimmy has been adopted by a member of Congress. That's an important move. But I think that beyond this, it would be great to see State Department expanding its ability to prioritize political prisoner release at the executive branch level. I advocated in my Hudson Institute report, which I published last December, for the creation of an Office of Political Prisoner Advocacy that would augment the work of the Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs and make it so that it is squarely within the U.S.'s realm to be able to not only advocate for U.S. Hostages abroad, but also for individuals like Jimmy Lai, who are not American citizens, but who are equally worthy of our best efforts.
Thank you. Ms. Hu, how you guys want to go?
First of all, Senator Scott, may I thank you for your very powerful advocacy for Jimmy Lai. He's extremely lucky to have you in his corner. We're very grateful for everything that you've done in relation to his case. I agree entirely with the remarks that you've made about Jimmy Lai and the importance of his case. And there is such urgency to his case now, given his state of health. And just to put that very starkly in context, there's a very strong evidence base showing that there is a much elevated risk of death in circumstances where you have elderly prisoners who are held on solitary confinement. That is elevated further when you have an elderly prisoner who's diabetic.
Right, with no sunlight.
With no sunlight, that's right. With no sunlight, limited fresh air, very limited, meaningful human interaction. So in any circumstances, regardless of the conditions, there's an elevated risk of death when you have someone held in solitary confinement for that length of time. International law is clear that once you hit 15 days, that's problematic. He's been held in solitary confinement for over 1,600 days. That's what we're dealing with since December 2020. So there's an elevated risk of death in any event. And because of his age and his state of health, that is a very real risk. Now, it seems to us that it is simply not in China's interests for Jimmy Lai to die in prison. You heard the name Liu Xiaobo earlier. It seems to us that if, as the Chinese Communist Party repeatedly say, they consider Jimmy Lai to be a notorious anti-China element and to be a risk to national security and so on, turning him into a martyr doesn't seem to be in their own interests either. We think there's a critical moment coming up now because as more focus is turning to US and UK relationships with China, it seems to us it's essential that Jimmy Lai's case is resolved before any talk of normalization or closer relations with China progresses. Our view is that Mr. Lai must be released before China is taken seriously as a credible negotiating partner, and we need to start seeing conditionality and consequences to engagement with China while Mr. Lai remains behind bars.
Thank you.
Senator Scott, thank you for your attention to this very, very important measure. I know that you were in Hong Kong in 2019, so I think your experience with Hong Kong also reflects the PRC's takeover. In regards to Jimmy Lai, I think In my opening remarks, I mentioned two recommendations. One is to prioritize human rights as a core U.S. foreign policy principle, and secondly, for the U.S. to urge for the release of Hong Kong's prisoners of conscience, including Jimmy Lai, Chow Hang-tung, Leung Kwok-hong, and Owen Chow. And I think it is a very, very crucial moment that we mention these names in every conversations that we are having with the PRC, including in regards to AI and trade. I think it is so crucial that we continue putting that pressure from the Congress and from the executive branch in regards to call for the release of Jimmy Lai and then the others.
I agree completely with all of these suggestions. I would just add that you and or members of the subcommittee, other members of the Senate, people in the administration, should relentlessly ask to see him, even if you know you're going to be denied, and insist on his release. It could be transactional, it could be situational, but the reality is that one of the ways that the U.S. and the German governments eventually secured the release of Liu Xiaobo's widow, who is arbitrarily detained for 8 or 9 years after his death, confined to solitary in her apartment in Beijing, was that they just kept asking. Angela Merkel just kept asking. Every single time she saw Xi Jinping, she just said, "You have to let her go. You have to let her go." And it was just it was that consistency and that the requests were made at that level. And I think that's something that easily people who are as committed to this issue as you are could do. Thanks.
Thanks for what each of you do. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Scott, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to the senator from Oregon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for putting this hearing together. And I'm struck about the similarity between what you're all presenting here, what is presented before the China Commission, which both then Senator Rubio and I had turns in chairing, and what came in the last September in the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong. Perhaps we'll see all of you at the third annual gathering of that here in September. And some of the things you mentioned just continues to strike a chord. Ms. Su, that lighting a candle is a crime. That suggests how dramatically Hong Kong has changed. And Ms. Richardson, your support for investigating crimes against humanity that China is involved in, including against the Uyghurs, and I co-wrote the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. I would like to see other countries adopt a similar presumed assumption that things that are made in certain areas of China have been made with slave labor. We have a safe harbor for companies can prove that it's not, but it's really, I think, the only effective answer, and only America's taken it. So we see goods rejected here shipped to Canada, which is unacceptable. Ms. Enos, your 21 recommendations. And Ms. Gallagher, your fierce conversation about the inhumanity of the way that Mr. Lai has been treated. His son Sebastian has come up here repeatedly, and along with others, to keep making that case. There are two bills that this committee, and I think, Mr. Chairman, you mentioned in your opening remarks, so I wasn't here. Well, the Hong Kong Judicial Sanctions Act, with Senator Sullivan and Curtis and myself are leading it, mandate sanctions on Hong Kong judicial officials complicit in human rights abuses. Do any of you support that, getting that done? I see nodding heads across the board. The second is the Stop CCP Money Laundering Act. Senator Curtis and I are co-leading that. And one of you mentioned money laundering as a significant factor. Does anyone see any reason not to proceed with getting that passed? Mr. Chairman, I really appreciate your suggestion that if our failure to pass legislation out of foreign relations on Hong Kong would be an implicit statement about our lack of concern. I don't want that to happen. So I hope we'll build on the foundation of those bills and many of the ideas that are presented here today to proceed. One thing that has really troubled me is the persistent business activity that Hong Kong has so valiantly tried to sustain and to give themselves cover. And of course, it's kind of a key vulnerability if companies were to translocate. Is there any sort of strategy in the works to try to move the financial operations, firms that participate, and say it's really unacceptable to be locating and contributing to what China has done in Hong Kong? Ms. Enos?
It's not business as usual in Hong Kong, and we all know this here, but I think many businesses would prefer to look the other way. We have to make it so that they can't look the other way. And this is a huge part of the reason why I have long advocated for a primary laundering, money laundering concern designation, especially for subsets of transactions or specific institutions, because that has the potential to shift risk. And we know this because a primary money laundering concern designation was used against North Korea, and the bank said, oh my goodness, we're not gonna touch Bank of Delta Asia once it had that primary money laundering concern designation issued. We need to start doing that for Hong Kong because businesses are continuing to buy the propaganda from John Lee and others that Hong Kong is just fine. But we know that they are actively supporting Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, that they're actively supporting other rogue actors like Iran and North Korea. And we know this because of a fabulous report that Sam Bickett did called Beneath the Harbor, which I would encourage, if it's possible, to submit that entire report to the record, if it's possible.
Mr. Chairman, we ask that the report be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Anybody else like to weigh in on this? Thank you.
Yes, just in relation to business, Senator Merkley, it's very important to say, I briefly referred to what happened to Apple Daily. And what's happened with Apple Daily is state-sponsored theft of a hugely successful business. So as well as being, of course, a real blow to press freedom, it's also a real cautionary tale for the over 1,300 US businesses which currently operate in Hong Kong, the 84,000 US citizens currently based in Hong Kong, because so vaguely defined are the offences under the national security law that anyone who's operating in that environment is at real risk. And what I would also say is that what we see with Hong Kong is it essentially becoming a bay of broken promises, a safe harbour for human rights violators, and it's essentially an authoritarian regime masquerading as a free market, free trade hub, finest laundromat for cleaning money in the East. And I'm always struck by those very powerful words which former Congressman Mike Gallagher used, where he described golden blindfolds being worn by individuals staring out the windows of their glass offices onto Victoria Harbour. And I think it's really critical because we know how important it is to Hong Kong and to China to have Hong Kong seen as a place where it's safe to do business. And we must keep calling out the fact that in its current guise, it is not a safe place to do business. And could I also ask that we read into the record, there's a very powerful piece which was recently written by the Committee to Protect Journalists on why what's happening under the national security law in eroding press freedom is also bad for business. It's from the 30th of June, and they pointed out that actually Hong Kong's economic boom happened because journalists could work without interference, and that what you now have is fading financial appeal in part because of Hong Kong trying to continue being seen as an international financial centre in circumstances where it has such gross restrictions on information and such a crackdown on press freedom. So it's bad for press freedom, it's also bad for business.
Mr. Chairman, can we put that report in the record? And could I follow up one point here? I know I'm over time. So as we think about the manufacturing that goes on with the Uyghurs in China, we're able to say to companies, consider moving to Vietnam. Not that their human rights record is perfect, but we're continuing to work closely with Vietnam and hopefully to see a much better situation there than with the Uyghurs or other places in Asia that have the potential for the same sort of manufacturing. But is there an alternative for the financial center in Hong Kong where we can say to a business, you could be in Kuala Lumpur, or could be where, you know, is it partly that there's no like magnet alternative that keeps these big companies doing their financial business in Hong Kong? Is there not a feasible alternative?
I'll try to answer both those questions. Olivia will do a better job on the alternative location question. But Senator Merkley, just very quickly, first of all, thank you for all of your hard work with the CECC. But the story of the last 40 years involves a lot of U.S. business activity and money flowing into China as the Chinese government got progressively more repressive. And as extraordinary an accomplishment as the UFLPA is, it should not have taken credible allegations of crimes against humanity and genocide to get us to that point.
Yes.
You know, we've had 40 years of occasionally a story floats up that, you know, X American company has been found using forced labor, or, you know, Y company is dealing with labor unrest inside China. What are we waiting for? These variables, I think, are extremely clear, and that unless and until U.S. companies and any companies are required to show that they are not part of the problem, we're going to keep having this conversation, and we'll only be able to pass laws when the situation has gotten exponentially worse than it should have. You know, this is not the direction everybody wanted to convince themselves we were going in post-Tiananmen. The argument was, let businesses invest, people will make money, repression will lessen, it'll all get better. That's not how it's turned out. Thank you.
I'm so glad Sophie raised UFLPA. I have lots of thoughts on that, but I won't address that. I'll go ahead and address, I think Singapore has been offered as a credible alternative. It has its drawbacks because it's very close with China and the CCP, but that has been the one that has come up most frequently. I think, though, we should be encouraging folks to just be more focused on like the UK and the US, which are the stronger financial centers to be focused on at this particular juncture. And I think that that should be an area of focus. I believe in the resilience of the market. I believe that businesses can be agile and can change directions. They're just choosing willfully to look the other way in the face of, as Sophie pointed out, just incredible evidence of ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity for Uyghurs, the near dissolution of freedom overnight in Hong Kong. I mean, it's fairly breathtaking over the last several years. So I think we're beyond the point of kind of saying, it's okay, businesses, you just didn't know. They absolutely know and are continuing to look the other way.
I would love to see a press story in which 25 major financial companies all together say we are moving to Singapore and we're doing it 6 months from now if X, Y, and Z don't change. We need some kind of shockwave to change the dynamic.
Well, and it's going to require folks like Jamie Dimon of, JP Morgan and Chase, who's continuing to underwrite, public offerings for Hong Kong companies to say, I'm not doing that anymore. We can't verify this because the rule of law is so undermined. And they have to stop coming when John Lee invites them for big, flashy business conferences where there's just tons of executives lining up.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Great line of questioning. If the witnesses will indulge us, the ranking member and I would like to just finish with a question or two ourselves. We can't pass up the opportunity to have you here and appreciate your expertise, and I'll yield to the ranking member.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two topics that I'd like to address briefly. Ms. Enos, you testified, and I was kind of taken aback with it, that it's not only that the U.S. has shuttered RFA operations with respect to China that would be in Cantonese, Tibetan, and Uyghur, and then in North Korea, but did you indicate that the CCP is taking over the shortwave frequencies that the U.S. was using for those broadcasts?
That's my understanding.
So that's pretty amazing. I mean, if we had just terminated the broadcast, but let's just broadcast white noise, which I guess is the audio version of a blank sheet of paper, we could have stopped the CCP from taking over the frequencies that we're using. But by terminating these programs and doing nothing, we're actually allowing the CCP communication channels that they didn't have before. So it's not just like the reduction of a U.S. effort. The reduction of the U.S. effort has handed an asset to the CCP that they're now using to further disinformation and oppression. Well, that's sort of a stunner. Now, the second thing I want to ask is this. I referenced in my opening testimony, but we didn't get into it in the Q&A, Ms. Sue, and I want to offer it to all of you. In the Uyghur area, among Uyghurs, and we have many Uyghurs who live in Virginia, the persecution of Uyghurs in China to sort of punish the human rights activists living in Virginia and the United States is kind of a thing, and we've seen a lot of examples of it. Are we seeing the same with respect to the persecution of Hong Kongers because of the activity of activists who've left Hong Kong, living in the United States, living elsewhere? Does it put their family members at risk who still live in Hong Kong?
Yes, absolutely. Senator, last month I testified before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission where we talked about the trends and policy approaches to transnational repression. And I referenced that actually a lot of the situations that our Hong Kong diaspora community is facing really mirrors what the CCP has been doing with the Uyghur and Tibetan communities, including this tactic of coercion by proxy, where also they are taking our family members, friends, and loved ones, including former colleagues and friends, back home as hostages. We have had cases of, Uyghur Americans in the Virginia area, their family members calling from mainland China, from East Turkestan, which is controlled by the PRC, asking their family members overseas to stop speaking about the Uyghur genocide, or else their family members are going to be taken to concentration camps. And we're seeing very similar tactics being employed against the Hong Kong community right now, where our family members and friends are constantly taken into interrogation, being asked by the police about our activities here in the United States. We've also had cases mentioned in the very beginning about Anna Kwok's father and brother being taken into interrogation and charged for having contact with her. I think that all illustrates the trends of transnational repression against the Hong Kong community as going towards the direction of what the Uyghur community has experienced. And unfortunately, that includes myself. I live in Virginia, and unfortunately, even after leaving Hong Kong, I still do not feel safe.
Thank you, Ms. Gallagher, and then back to the chair.
Yes, I just want to pay tribute to Joey and to Anna Kwok and to the others who've put up with such horrific targeting and essentially using human collateral in Hong Kong to try to put pressure on Americans and American residents here and people around the world. The tactics which are now being deployed by the Hong Kong authorities in relation to transnational repression are horrendous, and they're expanding. We've seen the headlines, of course, about the bounties and what they do there in relation to family members, but they're also broadening it and using it far, far more widely. And that includes, for example, targeting individuals outside the diaspora or exile communities. So, for example, I and my colleagues, simply for acting as international lawyers for Jimmy Lai, have been threatened with prosecution, called enemies of the state, have had a whole range of threats sent to us. I'm acutely conscious that because we do not have family members in Hong Kong, we are not under the same level of pressure. But it's important to say that this is now a new tactic which is expanding, and anyone who dares stand up to the Hong Kong authorities is being targeted. And may I highlight in particular Sebastian Lai, who of course has given testimony before this committee, simply for being a son speaking out for his father. Sebastian has been threatened with criminal prosecution. He's been threatened with criminal prosecution for addressing the United Nations. He's been accused of committing criminal offences, and as a result he has not seen his father since December 2020, and he will never see his father again unless the trajectory changes and we can secure Jimmy Lai's release.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll be brief. Ms. Gallagher, just one quick question, and if the others want to weigh in on it. Mr. Lai is a UK citizen. How would you assess London's response so far, and what coordination actions should the United States be taking with the UK and other allies to magnify all the things we've talked about today?
Thank you for the question. Yes, Jimmy Lai is a British citizen. He's only a British citizen. That is not recognised by the Chinese authorities, who consider because he's ethnically Chinese, he's Chinese, which of course should send a chill down the spine of anyone who, because of their ethnicity, could then be faced with the long arm of the Chinese state using those TNR tactics. The British government was slow out of the blocks, it's fair to say, to deal with this case. For a very long time, there was no commentary whatsoever coming from the UK about the case. And in fact, the US government showed real leadership in this space. We're very grateful for it. The US government called for Jimmy Lai's immediate and unconditional release before the UK government did so. And in fact, the UK government in December 2023 had a U-turn on its policy and finally called for Jimmy Lai's immediate and unconditional release, thanks to work which was done by members of this committee who just happened to be here on a day when I was testifying in December 2023 and when the then Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, was here. So what happened in Washington fundamentally altered the UK's position and gave the UK steel in this case. What we now need to see with the UK and US government working together is them using the leverage that they've got. He's a British citizen, but it's a case which intimately is connected to US government interests. US government and US officials are at the heart of the prosecution. US investors and US executives have had their assets appropriated, people who worked for Apple Daily and worked for Jimmy Lai. And we're very grateful to see that the US president now has twice referred to Jimmy Lai and the importance of securing his release, both on the campaign trail and since he's come into office. And we're very grateful to see the support that we're now getting from SPIHA, from state and from others. We want to see close working between the US and the UK to use the leverage that they've got. And most importantly, we know there's a series of high-level engagements coming up in the next number of months. Prime Minister Keir Starmer is due to be travelling to Beijing. Our view is that Prime Minister Keir Starmer should not travel to Beijing unless he sets as a condition that he will not go unless and until Jimmy Lai, a British citizen, is freed. And we would ask for your support here to ensure that the US hammers that message home in its bilateral engagement with the UK, to ensure the UK uses the leverage it's got to secure the release of their citizen.
Very well spoken. We're close to time, but if you, Dr. Richardson, go ahead.
Sure. I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase, nature abhors a vacuum. Nature has not got anything on the Chinese Communist Party. We have spent the last hour talking about what happens when democracies fail to advance protections or step back from protections of open democratic spaces. The Chinese government steps in. Media, business, the UN, human rights and democracies, citizens of democracies elsewhere. That it's my view that, even as of a few years ago, like-minded democracies had radically underinvested in the project of protecting democratic spaces and institutions, both for themselves and for people inside China, Hong Kong, who wanted the same things, right? We need more coordination. We need more resources. We need much higher ambition, much better interactions between the like-minded democracies, not less.
It's a great way to end. Thank you all. Thank you to our witnesses for attending today. Thank you to the ranking member. For the information of members, the record will remain open until the close of business day tomorrow, July 23rd. We ask the witnesses to respond as promptly as possible. Your responses will also be made part of the record. With that, I thank the committee, and we stand adjourned.